because the Friends of Westgate Park are intensely interested in the question of biodiversity. The fact that we have 300 species of locally indigenous plants in our park is part of that quest to improve the biodiversity of our park and our city. We've been focused very much on our park, but we'd like to look beyond that as well. We've also been focused on our plants, but we've now started to see what we think is probably biodiversity happening. So as you look here on these slides, you'll see, first of all, what the park used to look like and what it does now, but you'll also see the amazing diversity of both the 300 species that are planted in the park, but also the other things that have started to emerge. So insects, birds, they're the most obvious, but then we saw what's turned out to be 60 or more species of fungi appear. Now, you put the plants in, you don't put the fungi in. It comes from somewhere. And so this has started us on a journey of thinking about ecosystems, about food chains, and about what all this means to biodiversity. And that's really why we've organised this function today. Just a couple of points I'll make about the 300 species. We didn't ever anticipate that they would replicate what was there when this area was first settled by white people. It's rather the species that occurred within 5 kilometres, that's right, isn't it, Lecky? 5 kilometres of the CBD. So we also have soils from all over Melbourne, so we didn't ever set out to make this like it used to be.
There's no better place to start than with this map. This is an 1863 map. It's clearly been made clearly to me because I spent my earliest working life in the Navy, and so it's clear to me that this is a map intended for mariners. And I'd looked at it many, many times. It's my favourite map of any part of Melbourne, and it was only after multiple viewings of it and pondering over it that I noticed something quite significant. And I should have realised something I should have realised before, and that is the colour of the water here. Note that the bay, all those little dots you can see are actually figures, their depth of water. But the water in the river is the same colour until it gets to there, and then it becomes a different colour, and that signifies the presence of salt. So the river was salt water up to there. So for our purposes, and for any other purposes, the area along the river on both sides, from that point down to the bay, can be considered to be the estuary. Now, if you're going to convene a group of people to talk about biodiversity, there could probably be no better place to start to do it than where we are now, because we are within the estuary of the river. And the estuary was covered with a wide variety of vegetation zones, ecological vegetation classes, we would refer to them as, and these were all had high biodiversity, but none more so than these areas here, like this area, which came to be called West Melbourne Swamp, or sometimes Batman Swamp, and sometimes just the swamp, because it was undoubtedly the biggest and nearest to the settlement that grew up here. So this swamp here, I can tell you, had enormous biodiversity. We can't, unfortunately, quantify it in the way that we can. Say, Lynn mentioned a figure of the number of species in the area now. Unfortunately, we can't give a figure to what it was like at the time Europeans first settled the area, but given what has happened since then, we must imagine that quite realistically, I think that the figure would have been considerably higher. So there were a number of areas like this where there was more or less permanent water, saline environments, swamps over here, another one here which you will immediately recognise as what we refer to, of course, as Albert Park Lake, because it's still there. One of the few wetland, pre-European wetland areas that actually still can be seen in as a highly modified form, I might say. In here, this is a lagoon, saltwater lagoon, called Sandridge Lagoon. It was about a mile long, a bit more than a mile, and half a mile wide. And it ran through the middle of what is now Port Melbourne, the city area. The only indication that there is of that feature now is that there are two streets called Esplanade East and West that both have a very peculiarly parallel course, and in between them there is something called Lagoon Reserve. So that's the hint that there was something there once before. Now, the ecological zones, I mean, there are a number of them, as I said. Here we've got a brackish lake, so the vegetation there would have been salt tolerant, more ground cover, few trees. In the area generally on the northern side of the river, here there was a grassland, once again salt tolerant species, standing water on this side, but on this side there were some scattered mature trees. So botanists, ecologists would think of this as more a woodland area. But notwithstanding that, there were these areas here where clearly there was standing water. The vegetation in that was once again salt tolerant, aquatic species, rushes, those sorts of things. Along the river itself, you can see that there are these shaded areas here, or stippled areas. This vegetation close to the river was swamp scrub, and sometimes growing so thickly, melaleuca and tea tree, so thickly growing and arching over that it formed a bit of a tunnel, in fact, and this was a forbidding prospect to some people coming up the river. They had to get off the boats here. They could take their chances and walk across the swampy area, or if they had the money, they could hire a boat and take them and their goods up the river. One person described the experience and she found it very unnerving because she was sitting right down in the landscape. There was only about 30 centimetres difference in height between the land and the water. So she's sitting right down and low, can't see much ahead, and then she goes into a quite dark tunnel. So it's a forbidding prospect, but that sort of vegetation grew along the margins of the creek. Along here, behind the sand dunes, there was a mosaic of sandy, heathy and generally heathy vegetation growing along here. And most of this biodiversity, the greatest points, or the points of greatest biodiversity, if you like, was really in these swamps, these permanent swampy areas here, like in Sandridge Lagoon. And these were regarded by the different populations of the area, but for Aboriginal people, they were an absolute boon. They were the feature that allowed major gatherings of the Kulin Nation to take place, because these areas were, and they've been likened a number of times in print, to supermarkets. I think that this probably sells them a bit short, because certainly people could go to these areas and have access within a very small area to a range of foodstuffs. But they weren't only going there for food, they were acquiring a whole range of materials that were useful for, say, making baskets, and in some cases plants grew there that were of some medicinal value. So if we're going to regard them as supermarkets, we might also say as easily that they're also hardware stores and pharmacies, whatever. These features, such as this, and there were a number around the Melbourne area generally, were the places that allowed larger numbers of Aboriginal people to gather over longer periods of time than was generally the case. And this happened perhaps a couple of times a year. So the wetlands area, the wetland particularly, the swamps as they were called by Europeans, were the places that were sustaining that way of life. For Europeans, on the other hand, they were places of miasmic flux. Airborne diseases came out of swamps. And so in the early days, when the settlement was just here, and you can see that it's built around here, they avoided these areas. But in a very fundamental sense, you could say that in this part of the Melbourne area, these wetland areas, it had a very huge influence in terms of where the city would grow. And because they had such a low regard, people simply threw their rubbish into the wetlands. So by the 1880s, both Sandwich Lagoon and West Melbourne Swamp were full of rubbish and sewage, because sewage had been dumped in there for a very long time. So these places became even greater sources of disease in the eyes of the Europeans. You have to remember that it's only been comparatively recently that we've come to see what the value of these areas are like. We have a completely different view of wetlands now, and that, if in a very small way, is indicated by the way that we refer to them as wetlands. In the earliest days of European settlement, they were swamps. There's no difference, in fact, in terms of what is being referred to. It's just how you feel about it. And Europeans felt quite badly about them, so much so that they simply disregarded them and used them as rubbish tips. But nonetheless, you could say that just as with the indigenous population, the Kulin peoples who met in this area at regular intervals, the wetlands had a major impact for both Aboriginal people and for Europeans, if in a sense for the Europeans in a negative sort of way. And so basically, ultimately, all of these areas were reclaimed. Reclaimed is the word I've never quite understood exactly why it's reclaimed, or drained and hidden away, with the exception of this one here. And you could look here and you could not see a single drop of water. Likewise with the Sandwich Lagoon, that is now long gone. So this is probably diminished, certainly diminished the range of plant species, and that of course would also diminish the animals that would make their homes in these areas. So it was a great loss to the area in terms of biodiversity. And one final word is, if I've worked it out right, this area here is pretty close to being where Westgate Park is now. This is a painting by Frederick McCubbin, and it's titled the Near Fisherman's Bend. It's painted in the late 1870s. But of course, I should have said, Fisherman's Bend is up there. Now the river goes there. So he was on the northern side of the river at the time. People didn't take photographs, of course, of these areas because they weren't considered particularly great. So we have to rely basically on artistic representation. That's one, and that is a photograph, a watercolour of Batman's Hill, another feature of the landscape, not that it was a beauty point, but is now completely lost.